23-year-old Tyler Hutchinson walked into the courtroom like he was attending a premiere for a film he had directed. His hair was styled with deliberate precision, his borrowed suit tailored to fit his lean frame, and his eyes scanned the packed gallery with the calculating gaze of a performer assessing his audience. He didn't walk to the defense table. He sauntered, taking his time, making sure everyone saw him, making sure they understood that he was the main character in this drama. His attorney, already seated and looking exhausted before the trial had even begun, barely glanced up as Tyler settled into his chair with a satisfied smirk. Tyler had been charged with first-degree arson, reckless endangerment, and 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter. But he carried himself with the air of someone who believed he was untouchable, a digital-age provocateur who had simply taken his art too far. What Tyler didn't yet understand, what his narcissism and carefully curated online persona had shielded him from comprehending, was that this wasn't content. This was a reckoning. And the 3 lives he had taken, particularly the smallest one, would be the instrument of his complete and total destruction. The night of September 14th began like so many others for Tyler Hutchinson, in front of his phone camera, performing for an audience that existed in the digital ether. He had built a modest following of about 15,000 people across various social media platforms by positioning himself as an edgy content creator, someone who pushed boundaries, who said and did the things others were too afraid to attempt. His content was a toxic mixture of pranks that bordered on harassment, hot takes designed to generate outrage, and increasingly dangerous stunts that he framed as social experiments. His followers were mostly young men who praised his fearlessness and his willingness to expose societal hypocrisy, though in reality, Tyler was nothing more than a bully with a camera and a desperate need for validation. On this particular night, he had something special planned, something that would, in his mind, cement his reputation as someone who truly didn't care about consequences. He was going to burn down his ex-girlfriend's apartment building, and he was going to broadcast the entire thing live. Tyler's relationship with Jessica Martinez had ended 3 months prior, and he had not taken the breakup well. Jessica, a 22-year-old graduate student, had ended things after months of emotional abuse, gaslighting, and Tyler's increasingly controlling behavior. She had blocked him on all platforms, refused to engage with his attempts at contact, and had begun rebuilding her life without him, a rejection that Tyler's fragile ego could not tolerate. In his mind, Jessica had humiliated him, had rejected the gift of his attention, and she needed to be taught a lesson. He didn't see her as a person with her own autonomy and right to leave a toxic relationship. He saw her as a character in his story who had gone off script, and he was going to force her back into the narrative the only way he knew how, through spectacle and destruction. The apartment building where Jessica lived was a modest 3-story structure in a working-class neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. It housed 12 units, home to a diverse mix of families, students, and elderly residents. It was not a luxury building. It was home. On the night Tyler decided to set it ablaze, most of the residents were asleep or winding down from their day. Jessica was on the 2nd floor, Unit 204. On the 3rd floor, in Unit 3 and 12, lived the Tran family, Min and Lisa Tran, along with their 6-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma had spent the evening coloring pictures of butterflies at the kitchen table while her parents prepared for the next day. She had gone to bed at 8:30 p.m., clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, completely unaware that a stranger with a phone and a gas can was about to turn her home into an inferno. In Unit 108 on the 1st floor lived 67-year-old Robert Fletcher, a retired postal worker with a bad hip who moved slowly and relied on a walker. In Unit 201 lived Marcus Green, a night shift security guard, who had just gotten home and fallen into a deep sleep. None of these people knew Tyler Hutchinson. None of them had done anything to him. But Tyler didn't think about them at all. In his mind, the building was just a prop, and only Jessica mattered. At 11:43 p.m., Tyler positioned his phone on a makeshift tripod across the street from the apartment building, ensuring his face and the structure were both clearly visible in the frame. He went live on multiple platforms simultaneously, greeting his audience with his trademark cocky grin and exaggerated enthusiasm. "What's up, fam? Tyler here with some crazy content tonight. You guys are not ready for this," he announced, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. He panned the camera to show the apartment building, then back to his face. "See that place? My psycho ex lives there. She thinks she can just ghost me, block me, act like I don't exist? Nah, tonight she's gonna remember me." He pulled out a red gas can from behind a bush, holding it up to the camera like a game show host revealing a prize. "We're gonna light this place up. Not literally kill anyone or anything," he added with a laugh. "Just scare her a little. Teach her a lesson about respect." The comments on his live stream were a mixture of reactions. Some viewers urged him to stop, calling him insane, threatening to call the police. Others egged him on, dropping fire emojis and laughing emojis, treating the entire thing like entertainment. Tyler thrived on both. The outrage and the encouragement were fuel for the same fire. He approached the building's side entrance, which led to a storage area, and the building's ancient electrical system. He doused the entrance with gasoline, narrating every action like a sports commentator. All right, here we go. This is history in the making right here," he said, his voice trembling with adrenaline and excitement. He pulled out a lighter, held it up to the camera, and grinned. "For all the haters who said I wouldn't do it, watch this." He flicked the lighter and tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked ground. The flames erupted instantly, far more violently than Tyler had anticipated. The fire raced up the side of the building with terrifying speed, feeding on the old wood siding and quickly spreading to the interior walls. Tyler stumbled backward, laughing nervously, his phone still recording. Oh shit. That's way bigger than I thought. Holy hell!" His tone was still playful, still performing, but there was an edge of uncertainty creeping in. The fire was already out of control, smoke billowing into the night sky. And Tyler's brain, wired for content and clout, failed to make the connection between the spectacle he was creating and the human beings inside. He filmed for another 2 minutes, capturing the flames climbing higher, the windows on the first floor beginning to glow orange from within. Then, as sirens began to wail in the distance, self-preservation finally kicked in. "All right, I'm out. I gotta bounce before the cops show up," he said into the camera, still grinning. He grabbed his phone and ran, leaving the fire to rage unchecked, leaving the residents inside to face a nightmare he had created and abandoned. The 911 calls started coming in at 11:47 p.m., panicked voices reporting flames and smoke pouring from the apartment building on Riverside Avenue. The Portland Fire Department dispatched 3 engine companies and a ladder truck, arriving on scene within 6 minutes to find the structure fully engulfed. Residents were pouring out of the building in various states of terror and undress. Some had been asleep and woken to smoke. Others had heard the crackling and seen the glow. Firefighters immediately began accounting for residents, and that's when the horrifying reality set in. Not everyone had made it out. Jessica Martinez had escaped from her second-floor unit by climbing out a window onto a ledge and jumping, breaking her ankle in the fall but surviving. Marcus Green had been awakened by a neighbor pounding on his door and had managed to stumble out through the smoke. Robert Fletcher, the elderly man on the first floor, had been pulled from his apartment by firefighters, unconscious from smoke inhalation. He would die in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, his lungs too damaged, his body too frail to survive the trauma. But the Tran family was still inside. Min and Lisa had been on the 3rd floor when the smoke alarms began shrieking. They tried to escape down the stairs, but the stairwell was already filled with thick black smoke and flames. Lisa collapsed halfway down, overcome by smoke inhalation. Min tried to carry her, but he too succumbed. His body found later by firefighters just steps from the exit, his arms still wrapped around his wife. Both were pronounced dead at the scene, but the most devastating discovery came later, after the flames had been suppressed and the fire marshal's team began their grim search of the structure. In Unit 312, in a small bedroom closet, they found 6-year-old Emma Tran. She had done exactly what children are often taught to do in a fire. She had hidden, seeking the imagined safety of a small enclosed space. She had pulled her stuffed rabbit close and waited for help that came too late. The fire had not reached her directly, but the smoke had. She had died of asphyxiation, alone and terrified in a closet that became her tomb. The investigation into the fire's origin was swift, and thanks to Tyler's own hubris, absurdly easy. Multiple viewers of his live stream had recorded the broadcast and immediately sent the footage to the Portland Police Department. By 2 a.m., detectives had identified Tyler Hutchinson, located his address, and obtained a warrant for his arrest. They found him at his apartment, asleep in his bed, his phone still logged into his social media accounts where the video of him setting the fire was still being shared and commented on. He woke to the sound of his door being kicked in, police flooding his bedroom with guns drawn, and his world collapsing in real time. When detectives informed him that 3 people had died in the fire, his response was not remorse, but disbelief. "Wait, what? No, that's not. People were supposed to get out. I didn't know people were inside," he stammered, his voice high and panicked. But his ignorance was not a defense. It was an indictment. He had set a fire in an occupied building without any regard for who might be inside. And now 3 people were dead because of his narcissistic need for attention. The case was handed to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, where it landed on the desk of Senior Deputy DA Catherine Walsh, a veteran prosecutor known for her meticulous preparation and her ability to distill complex cases into clear, compelling narratives for juries. When Walsh reviewed the evidence, the livestream video, the forensic reports, the witness statements, she felt a cold, focused rage settle over her. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a crime of ego, committed by a young man so consumed with his online persona that he had lost any connection to the real-world consequences of his actions. Walsh knew that convicting Tyler on the technical charges would be easy. The video was ironclad proof, but she wanted the jury to understand the full weight of what he had done, to see the faces of the victims, to hear about the 6-year-old girl who died afraid and alone because Tyler Hutchinson wanted to get back at his ex-girlfriend and gain internet clout. Tyler's attorney, a public defender named Marcus Liu, was assigned the case and immediately understood the impossibility of his task. The evidence was overwhelming. The crime was recorded and broadcast by the defendant himself, and the victims included a child. There was no legal defense that could result in an acquittal. Liu's only option was to negotiate a plea deal or, failing that, to try to humanize Tyler enough to avoid the maximum sentence. He met with his client and was immediately struck by Tyler's complete disconnect from reality. Tyler spoke about the case as if it were a public relations problem, not a criminal prosecution. He was worried about his brand, about how this would affect his career as a content creator. He referred to the victims in abstract terms, as if they were characters in a story, rather than real people with families and futures that he had stolen. Liu tried to explain the severity of the charges, the possibility of life in prison, but Tyler seemed unable to grasp it. In his mind, he was the victim, vilified by the media, misunderstood by the public, persecuted by a system that didn't understand internet culture. The trial began on a gray March morning. The courtroom packed with journalists, members of the Tran and Fletcher families, and members of the public who had followed the case with horrified fascination. Tyler entered wearing a suit, his hair styled, his face arranged in an expression he clearly thought conveyed seriousness and remorse, but which read to everyone else as performative and shallow. He took his seat at the defense table and immediately began scanning the courtroom, his eyes lingering on the sketch artist, on the cameras positioned at the back of the room. He was still performing, still thinking in terms of optics and audience, unable to turn off the persona that had defined his existence. Judge Patricia Connolly, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for running a tight courtroom, watched him with barely concealed distaste. She had read the case file, had watched the live stream video, and had already formed an opinion about the defendant's character. But she was a professional, and she would ensure he received a fair trial, even if every instinct told her he deserved none of the mercy he had denied his victims. The jury was seated after 3 days of selection, a careful process of finding 12 people who could set aside the pretrial publicity and judge the case on the evidence presented in court. They were a diverse group, ranging in age from late 20s to early 70s, and they included two parents of young children who would prove especially attentive during the testimony about Emma Tran. Walsh's opening statement was a masterwork of prosecutorial storytelling. She began not with Tyler but with the victims. She described Robert Fletcher's life of service, his decades delivering mail, his plans for retirement that he would never enjoy. She spoke of Min and Lisa Tran, immigrants who had built a life in America, who worked hard and loved their daughter. And then she spoke of Emma, a first grader who loved butterflies and wanted to be a veterinarian, whose life was stolen by a man who was playing with fire for internet likes. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobbing of Emma's grandmother in the front row. Walsh then turned to Tyler, describing him not as a misunderstood artist, but as a narcissist who valued attention over human life, who had set a building full of people on fire because his ego couldn't handle rejection. She promised the jury they would see the live stream, hear from the fire marshal, and understand that this was not an accident or a prank gone wrong, but a reckless, knowing act that resulted in 3 deaths. Marcus Liu's opening statement was a difficult balancing act. He couldn't deny what Tyler had done. It was on video. But he tried to frame it as a moment of terrible judgment by a young man who never intended to hurt anyone. He spoke of Tyler's youth, his immaturity, his inability to foresee the consequences of his actions. He asked the jury to consider that Tyler had been trying to scare his ex-girlfriend, not kill anyone, and that the deaths were a tragic and unintended result of a stupid, impulsive decision. It was a reasonable argument from a legal standpoint, but it lacked emotional weight because Tyler's own behavior was already undermining it. Throughout Liu's opening, Tyler sat with a distant, almost bored expression, occasionally nodding as if critiquing his attorney's performance. Several jurors noticed, their expressions hardening. The prosecution's case began with the presentation of the live stream video. The courtroom lights were dimmed and Tyler's voice filled the space, cocky, excited, proud. The jury watched in silence as he showed the gas can, doused the building and lit the fire. They watched him laugh as the flames erupted, watched him film the building burning, watched him flee. The video was devastating, not just because it documented the crime, but because it revealed Tyler's mindset in those crucial moments. He was having fun. He was entertaining his audience. He gave no thought whatsoever to the human beings inside. When the video ended and the lights came back up, several jurors looked physically ill. Tyler, sitting at the defense table, watched his own performance with a critical eye, as if reviewing his content for engagement metrics. He even whispered something to his attorney and gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. It was a catastrophic display of his complete lack of self-awareness and empathy. The firefighters who responded to the scene testified next, describing the chaos, the intensity of the blaze, and the desperate rescue attempts. One firefighter broke down on the stand as he described finding Min Tran's body just feet from the exit, his arms still around his wife, and knowing there was nothing he could have done to save them. The testimony was raw and emotional, and it painted a vivid picture of the hell that Tyler had created. Throughout this testimony, Tyler sat with his chin in his hand, occasionally glancing at his phone that had been confiscated, as if bored by the proceedings. His behavior was so inappropriate, so disconnected from the gravity of what was being described, that Judge Connolly issued multiple warnings, instructing him to sit up and pay attention. But the warnings had no effect. In Tyler's mind, this was all just a temporary inconvenience, a narrative arc that would eventually resolve in his favor. Then came the fire marshal, Deputy Chief Raymond Foster, a 30-year veteran of fire investigation with a reputation for thoroughness and integrity. Foster took the stand with a thick file of reports and photographs, and Walsh guided him through his findings methodically. He explained how he had determined the fire's origin, the accelerant used, and the speed at which the flames had spread through the building's old structure. He testified that the fire had been set intentionally, that it had been designed to cause maximum damage, and that anyone with even basic knowledge of fire behavior would have known it posed a lethal risk to anyone inside. His testimony was clinical and precise, building the foundation for the involuntary manslaughter charges. But then Walsh asked the question that would change the entire tenor of the trial. Deputy Chief Foster, can you describe for the jury how you located the victims? Foster's expression, which had been professional and controlled, softened with visible pain. He took a deep breath and began to describe the search of the building after the flames were suppressed, the process of checking each unit for casualties. He spoke of finding Min and Lisa Tran in the stairwell, of the horrific realization that they had almost made it out. And then he spoke of Emma. "We found her in the bedroom closet of Unit 312, he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the emotion beneath. She had crawled in there, probably scared by the smoke and the noise. She was holding a stuffed animal, a rabbit. She died from smoke inhalation. She didn't burn. She just ran out of air." The courtroom was utterly silent. Emma's grandmother let out a soft, keening wail of grief. Several jurors were openly crying. Walsh let the moment breathe, let the jury sit with the image of a 6-year-old child hiding in a closet, terrified, waiting for help that never came. Then she asked, "Deputy Chief, in your professional opinion, was this death preventable?" Foster nodded. "Absolutely. If the fire had not been intentionally set, if emergency services had been called immediately, if the perpetrator had shown even a shred of concern for the residents, Emma Tran would be alive. She died because someone valued spectacle over human life. For the first time in the entire trial, Tyler's face changed. The smirk, the detachment, the performative confidence, it all cracked. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes widened, and his face went pale. He was hearing for the first time the specific details of what his actions had caused. Not abstract casualties or victims, but a 6-year-old girl who died afraid in a closet. For a brief, terrible moment, the narcissistic shield that had protected him from reality faltered, and something that might have been genuine horror flickered across his features. He looked down at his hands, his breathing quickened, and for the first time, the jury saw something that resembled a human reaction. But Tyler's defense was still to come. Liu called a psychologist who testified about Tyler's troubled childhood, his narcissistic personality disorder, his need for external validation that had been warped by social media culture. The psychologist argued that Tyler's online persona had become so consuming that he had lost the ability to distinguish between performance and reality, between content and consequences. It was a compelling argument from a clinical perspective, but it was also deeply unsatisfying to anyone who believed in personal responsibility. Walsh's cross-examination was brutal, forcing the psychologist to admit that millions of people struggle with similar issues without setting buildings on fire, that personality disorders explain behavior but do not excuse it, and that Tyler had made a deliberate choice to commit this act. The defense also called Jessica Martinez, Tyler's ex-girlfriend, who had survived the fire by jumping from a window. Liu hoped she would provide some context for Tyler's state of mind, perhaps testify that their relationship had been mutually toxic, that Tyler had been provoked. But Jessica had no interest in helping Tyler. She took the stand and described months of emotional abuse, of Tyler's refusal to accept that their relationship was over, of his increasingly threatening messages before she finally blocked him. "He told me I would regret leaving him," she testified, her voice shaking with anger more than fear. "He said he would make sure everyone knew he was the victim. He said he would make me pay. And then he tried to burn down my home." She looked directly at Tyler as she spoke, and he couldn't meet her eyes. 3 people are dead because his ego couldn't handle being told no. He doesn't deserve anyone's sympathy. Tyler did not testify in his own defense. Liu wisely kept him off the stand, knowing that his personality would alienate the jury even further. But Tyler's silence spoke volumes. He had been desperate to be the center of attention, to control his own narrative. And now, when it mattered most, he had nothing to say. The closing arguments were powerful and emotional. Walsh reminded the jury of Emma Tran, of her stuffed rabbit, of the future she would never have because Tyler Hutchinson valued internet clout over human life. She urged them to hold him accountable for all 3 deaths, to send a message that actions have consequences, that performance doesn't matter when real people die. Liu asked for mercy, for consideration of Tyler's mental health issues, for a verdict that reflected his lack of intent to kill. But his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence and the image of a child dying alone. The jury deliberated for 7 hours over 2 days. When they returned, their faces were grim and resolved. The foreman stood and delivered guilty verdicts on all counts. First-degree arson, 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment. Tyler's face crumbled. The confidence, the persona, the armor, it all disintegrated in that moment. He put his head in his hands and began to sob. Not the quiet tears of remorse, but the loud, gasping cries of someone who had finally, devastatingly, understood that his life was over. The jury had seen through his performance and judged him for who he truly was. 3 weeks later, the courtroom reconvened for sentencing. The victim impact statements were heartbreaking. Robert Fletcher's daughter spoke of her father's kindness and the decades of stories he would never tell. Min Tran's brother described the hopes and dreams his sibling had brought to America, all extinguished in a single night. And then Emma's grandmother took the stand. She was a small, elderly woman who could barely see over the podium, but her voice was strong and clear. She spoke in halting English about her granddaughter's smile, her love of butterflies, the way she would run to greet her after school. She was 6 years old, the grandmother said, her voice breaking. She had her whole life, and he took it for a video for strangers on the internet. She died alone, scared, calling for her mommy who couldn't reach her. How can that be forgiven? Judge Connolly asked Tyler if he had anything to say. He stood, his face red and swollen from crying, and tried to speak. But all that came out were choked sobs and fragments of apologies that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Judge Connolly let him stand there for a long moment, let him feel the weight of his inadequacy, before instructing him to sit. She then delivered a statement that was both a legal judgment and a moral condemnation. Mr. Hutchinson, you treated this crime as performance art, as content for an audience that you valued more than human life. You set a building full of people on fire and filmed yourself doing it, laughing as it burned. 3 people died because you could not accept rejection, because your need for attention eclipsed any sense of empathy or responsibility. She paused, her eyes hard. In your live stream, you said people were supposed to get out, that you didn't think anyone would die. But you never checked. You never warned anyone. You never called for help. You just lit the fire and walked away, more concerned with your viewer count than with the human beings you were condemning to death. And when you finally understood what you had done, when you heard about Emma Tran hiding in that closet, you felt something that resembled remorse. But that moment of clarity does not undo the choices you made, the lives you took, or the families you destroyed. Judge Connolly sentenced Tyler to 45 years in state prison, 15 years for each count of involuntary manslaughter, to be served consecutively. He would be eligible for parole when he was 68 years old, assuming he lived that long. As the sentence was read, Tyler collapsed forward onto the defense table, his body shaking with sobs. The bailiffs had to physically lift him to his feet and lead him out of the courtroom. His cries echoed through the halls, the desperate wails of a man who had finally, irrevocably, learned that the real world has consequences that no amount of performance can erase. The live stream that was supposed to make him infamous had instead made him a cautionary tale, a narcissist who played with fire and burned down his entire life, taking 3 innocent people with him into the flames.